Good morning. First, I would like to thank the organization that accepted my proposal. My name is Andrea Mariani. I'm the secretary and one of the founders of the Association of Social Promotion Popolo di Brig. The aim of this contribution is to explain our experimentations about beer production. Born in 2004, Popolo di Brig is settled in Vimercate, a small city north of Milan. As a reenactment group focused on Celts and Ligurians of the Second Iron Age, during our events we started to experiment the preparation of archaeologically and historically compatible foods and drinks. In the slide you can see some examples of foods and drinks that we usually cook and prepare during our reenacting events. The Beer Brig project, in its early embryonic state, dates back to 2008. The project was officially established in early 2013, getting the involvement of our association, whose aims include both educational activities and experimental archaeology. Beside ancient beer, for over 10 years since we started, we focus on preparation of mead, grog, and spiced wine. In our first experiments, we focused about the recreation of the so-called Pombia Beer. This is a fermented cereals beverage that dates back to the 6th century BCE. Starting from the pollen analysis of the organic remains within a pottery beaker, deriving from the report of the excavation of the Iron Age necropolis of Pombia, we tried to reconstruct and develop the brewing process from germination up to tasting the results. This specific beverage appears quite interesting due to the presence of traces related to hop pollen. Some studies confirmed that the beverage was a kind of red beer, probably the Cervesia or Cervisia mentioned by Pliny and Isidore of Seville. The word theoretically derives from the Indo-European "kerevos", meaning deer or referring to the color red. The beaker's profile and design looks particularly remarkable. Its flared mouth allows an easy disgorgement of the foam that could contain residual chaff, while its smaller size and volume, 18 centiliters, could be connected to the alcoholic content of the drink. We are not master brewers, neither by training nor by profession, so we had to proceed by trial and error. We have experimented thrice with different settings and making some alterations each time, a reproduction of the Pombia Beer. First experiment. Step 1. The cereal kernels were drenched for about 48 hours, removing them from the water every 4 hours. Step 2. The kernels were spread in a cool and hard place for 3 days. On the third day, the kernels have sprouted. Step 3. The sprouted kernels were toasted in 2 different types of kiln, a pit lined with bricks, a bin with a metal dome, in order to reproduce the conditions of ancient cookers, such as the oven for domestic use with off-carbonized malt remains found in the Celtic Ligurian settlement of Roquepertuse, France, dated to the 5th century BCE. The whole operation, excluding the construction of the structures, involved 3 people for an overall time of almost 16 hours, an afternoon and a whole night. The total volume of the malt obtained after the processing was around 25 kilograms. Step 4. After 4 weeks of seed, 20 kilograms of malt were coarsely crushed using a handstone grinder. Step 5. 10 kilograms of ground malt were transferred to a chestnut wood vat and covered with water heated to about 80 degrees. Step 6. After a night of rest, the must is collected in a tin copper cauldron, filtered through some hay laid at the bottom of the vat, and would explain the presence of the pollen of herbaceous angiosperm detected by the analysis. During the operation, more hot water was added to the vat and then to the cauldron. Step 7. The liquid is heated along with a small amount of wild hops. Step 8. The liquid is poured into a chestnut wooden barrel with a volume of 28 liters. Once having repeated the steps 5, 6, and 7, other 28 liters are poured into the vat, previously cleaned of hay and sealed with a wooden lid. Fermentation begins without adding external yeast. As supposed by Stika in one of his studies, fermentation starts by the action of the yeast remains produced by the beer which was previously stored within the containers. Actually, we had previously prepared 2 different beers. 2 weeks later, we added 100 grams of a wildflower honey to each of the 2 containers, being a monoessence honey very unlikely for the Iron Age. Keeping the same recipe and using the same malt, but this time resorting to a stainless steel fermenter, a small amount of beer was also produced and then bottled in modern bottles. Second experiment. With 8 kilograms of leftover malt from the previous experiment stored in a dry place for another 3 months, a second barrel of beer has been produced using the same methodology. In the third experiment, we paid more attention to the data collection and we made some changes to the process. The whole cereal amount used, 25 kilograms, was toasted within a rectangular trench of about 120 for 90 for 35 centimeters, excavated into the ground and closed by a cappuccino cover made of CBM tiles. The grains were laid on 2 kind of steps along the longer sides of the trench, while a fire was lit and kept alive in the central spot of the trench. This experimentation is inspired by 2 trenches containing carbonized barley malt and bricks fragments unearthed in the rural settlement of Ochdorf, Germany, dated to the 5th and 4th century BCE. The structures could have been likely used for both germination and malt toast. The usable capacity of the oven was only 2.5 kilograms. Trying to increase this amount, we found out that the consequent volume increase prevented the heat from reaching part of the cereals. We reached a level of toasting sufficient to halt the germination between 25 and 35 minutes, depending on the intensity of the heat. The result, however, was inhomogeneous. As the grains closest to the center of the trench were partially or sometimes totally burnt, the more distant ones only dried, keeping a very light color inside. The whole operation, excluding the construction of the structure, involved 2 people for 16 hours. In this experiment, the hay acting as a filter was replaced by straw, which usually contains pollinating flowers, both in order to avoid its excessive influence on taste and color of the beer produced. The pollen of gramineous plants detected in the Pombia remains cannot derive from the simple use of the grains, which, as seeds, do not contain any. This time we also decide not to include hop petals among the ingredients, despite its pollens being detected in a very low percentage. Being a dioecious plant, the presence of pollen does not prove the occurrence of female flowers, now used in brewing. This appears more easily explained by an accidental inclusion within the resin or in the beer itself due to the anemophilous transportation. We distributed the must, 78 liters overall, between 3 different vessels. The first was the same chestnut barrel used in the 2 previous trials. The second one was a dolium of earthenware, waterproofed using beeswax, mixed with a slight amount of resin and sealed with a cork. The third container was a modern stainless steel fermenter. In each of the three circumstances, the product obtained is a watery beer with a woody and sour taste, similar to alembic Belgian beers, low in alcohol content. About the color, it was cloudy greenish-yellow with the use of hay, red with the use of straw, very dark for the beer stored in the chestnut vat. About the alcohol content, the tested cereal of the third experiment, partly burned and partly not completely dried, with the subsequent difficulties in grinding the grains, which tended to squash rather than to crush, probably hindered the extraction of sugars. Hence, a particularly low alcohol content, between 1.9 and 2.6 alcoholic degrees, depending on the container, compared to the 3.3 achieved with the second experiment. Unfortunately, we did not manage to produce any record or data from the first experiment. About the taste, we recorded leguminous hints as lentils from the beer produced with the first and second experimentation, preserved in the barrel. The beer stored in the vat held a markedly tannic, bitter taste, with hints of dried fruit, mostly walnut. The beer stored in the cask within the third experimentation retained a particularly acidic flavor, maybe due to some mold. Honey and smokiness were more perceptible regarding the beer which was stored in the bottle during the first experimentation. The beer stored within the modern stainless steel fermenter displayed a very sour and smoky flavor. Finally, honey taste was present in the beer which was preserved within the dolium, probably due to the presence of beeswax. The carbonation was variable according to the containers, completely absent from barrel and vat, barely noticeable within the wax and resin-coated dolium, probably not completely waterproofed, unmistakable in the stainless steel fermenter, where, however, it disappeared shortly after opening and marked in the bottle. Overall, the beers were drinkable, but their flavor proved to be remarkably far from modern taste. The experiments raised new questions, as well as challenging the participants with some difficulties. How to start the fermentation? As previously mentioned, we based our first experimentation on Ostica's conjectures and suggestions, but currently we would like to repeat our experimentation focusing about how to start the fermentation process using fruit. Aerobic or anaerobic fermentation, we choose the latter for logistic and practical reasons, but in the future we would like to run another phase of experimentation involving the aerobic fermentation as well. After the new contacts we made in Trento attending EAC 11, the Council of the Association decided to support new experiments. These should have restarted at the beginning of 2020 in order to participate to an event in Germany, thanks to the invitation of Eva Gotting and the support of the open-air museum Duppel settled near Berlin. Actually, it was supposed for me to share with you all our latest results, but unfortunately 2020 brought us nasty surprises. It was impossible for us to proceed with new experiments. Moreover, much of the material used for the experimentations without maintenance became unusable. This unexpected cost forced us to establish the second cycle of experiments lasting 2 years. Our team size has increased. We want to start, whenever possible, a new experiment aimed at the reproduction of Hochdorf beer, a beverage marked out by the presence of Artemisia vulgaris and wild carrots. Actually, between 2012 and 2013, we had already tried to partially replicate this beer. Furthermore, next spring we will resume the trials related to the preparation of grog, which in 2016 and 2017 we carried out only using modern production and storage methods. Finally, in the last weeks, we start new experimentations about fermentation. We are open to cooperation and we hope to find new partners among the EXARC members. Thank you for your kind attention.